Hey everyone. If you love this podcast, can you do me a big favor and please give us a review on whatever platform you're using and tell a friend or family member to subscribe? And speaking of subscribing, that's the best way to keep up because you'll get a notification each time we upload a new episode. So make sure you hit subscribe on whatever platform you're now using. Finally, if you're feeling generous, appreciative, or perhaps a bit guilty for getting all this free content, go to patreon.com/The Suzanne Venker Show and become a member. You'll get free ebooks, early access to the episodes, and a chance to win the occasional free 30-minute coaching session with yours truly. From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week as we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narrative about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. So today I'm going to talk about the 4 C's of every marriage or relationship and hone in on the one that gives couples the most trouble. But before I continue, I think it would mean a lot to people who don't know about this podcast when they're scrolling around YouTube or whatever platform they're using and you've hit the subscribe button and you've left a 5-star review. It pops up in their feed and gets the Suzanne Venker Show in front of more people. I know many of you are as frustrated as I am with the way our culture undermines our success in love and in life for that matter, and you feel like you have no recourse. So I'm giving you something you can actually do with those feelings. By subscribing to the show and leaving a review, you're helping to get the word out to other people who desperately need it. Somehow those reviews cause the needle of the algorithms to move up. Let's put it that way when you do that. So it's kind of a win-win for all of us. So, okay, back to today's show. So I'm going to talk about the 4 C's of every relationship. And you might have heard about the 3 C's. If you Google the 3 C's of a relationship, you'll see these. But I've added a 4th that I think is really critical that I never see. And then we're going to hone in on the 4th one of those 4 that is the most problematic from what I've seen and certainly what I've experienced myself. Okay, so those 4 things are... drum roll, please. Chemistry, compatibility, commitment, that's the one you won't see, I don't think, and communication. These are obvious. They are what they say they are. Chemistry is simply physical attraction, and most of us get together with our other person, with our spouse, by initially having been physically attracted to them. There are obviously exceptions to this rule. I guess if you have an arranged marriage, it might be a little different, but that's not the country we live in. So typically it's all about chemistry and those feelings and love and all of that. The loving feelings, I should say, the feeling and love, which which is typically how the whole thing begins. I personally believe because chemistry is biological, it's kind of random. Like, you're not attracted to the same thing I am and vice versa, but it's biological. And that if you had it once with your person, you can always have it again with the right conditions. So for those who've been married for a long time, I'm going to be doing a separate episode on the unique sexual drives of men and women. So stay tuned for that because that's a separate conversation, but my argument is basically if you had it once, you can have it again. You just have to know how to push those buttons. But that's not today's show. Okay, so chemistry. Pretty easy, right? When we first start out. It's just a no-brainer. There's nothing you have to do to make it happen. It just sort of happens. And then from there, there's the compatibility piece, which refers to how well we get along with the other person. We might have some common interests or activities, or maybe we view people in the world similarly. That's a big one. And sometimes we can't even put our finger on why we get along so well. We just do. You know, that feeling that you might have had, probably had, where you feel like you've known the person forever, right? Even though you've only been together a few months, that kind of thing. That's compatibility. Then that moves over time, hopefully, into commitment. And the commitment piece is, along with the last one we're going to be talking about today, which is communication. The commitment piece is as, in my opinion, significant as the communication piece, because this has to do, and you rarely see this when you're talking about these, when you look up these 3 C's. It's just a glaring omission, in my opinion, because your view of marriage itself is massive. And I think I kind of mentioned this in one of my previous episodes, where I said, if it weren't for marriage, a lot of people might not even still be together. If you were just dating, it's much easier to leave. But if you're married, especially once kids are part of the equation, you figure it out, or you're forced to figure it out. And that's kind of the whole point, right? Barring any abuse, that's the whole purpose of marriage. So if you're married to somebody who has one foot out the door, or who thinks more lax about marriage, where, well, you can always get divorced, that person's brain isn't going to be in it in the way yours is, which is why it's so crucial that both people have the same view of marriage itself. There's just something that happens when you're married and you feel like you can't leave, that causes you to handle things differently. The Harvard scientist, Dan Gilbert, he wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness, and he wrote in there that the psychological immune system actually works best when we're totally stuck, when we're trapped, which sounds somewhat counterintuitive, but it's that feeling of knowing, well, this is it, there's nowhere else to go, that causes your brain to figure it out, for lack of a better word, in a way that you wouldn't if you were not, quote unquote, trapped. So it's kind of a mind, it's just a mindset is what it is. It's not, obviously, technically you're not stuck, but you should think of it that way, because that will help you. When a decision's final, we engage in a variety of psychological processes, I guess, that cause us to find solutions where we might otherwise not. So that's how crucial commitment is. So that's why I added that 4th C to this equation. But it's the last one that we're going to talk about today, communication, that is almost always the greatest sticking point for all of us who are married. I don't think there's anyone who is exempt from this. If you are going to be married to somebody for decades, you are going to have communication issues. There's just no way. That would be remarkable if you spent, 40, 50 years never having any communication problems. So what is communication exactly in a marriage? It will include, it just incorporates so much. There's just a huge umbrella as to how we make compromises, being able to ask for what we want and what we don't want, how we negotiate time, space from each other, money, sex, chores, and so on. There's just so much incorporated under this one umbrella. And here's the significant part. This is where our childhood messaging comes into play. This is what makes it so difficult, in part. Whatever we saw growing up between our parents tends to be our view of how things should be done. Or if not that, then our knee-jerk response to something, because we're so programmed programmed to respond in a certain way based on what we saw. And then, of course, if you didn't see anything because you were a single parent home, that's a whole nother thing. So let's talk about a couple different backgrounds that we all likely have, or had, sorry. There's the single parent home, which invariably means that unless you're parent remarried, you are sort of, it's just a blank slate there. There's no model. It's not that there's a bad model, there's not a good model, there's just no model. It's just a hole. So you're just completely in the dark about how to communicate with the opposite sex. And so that invariably would cause you to develop, to have difficulty trusting the process because you've never seen it in action. And so you typically will have learned to do everything on your own and not rely on anyone, right? And so your ability to trust your own person later in life is compromised. I likened this also to people who had alcoholism in their family. Because from what I've seen, the takeaway or the result is very similar. Because if you had a parent who was an alcoholic, which again, that's a whole nother podcast episode of its own, but it's so disruptive to the parenting process because you never really have that person 100% of the time. You have, from what I understand, I did not grow up with an alcoholic parent, but I certainly have friends who did. You grew up with kind of two people, and you never knew what you were going to get. And so if you can't count on somebody to be a consistent presence in your life, whether they're physically there or not, because you got divorced, your parents got divorced, or they're in the home but they're an alcoholic, it's not that different in that you're not. I mean, obviously, it's better to be there, not to be there. I guess I don't know. That's a conversation for people who've experienced those. Not me. But in this one way, you have learned to not count on that person. We can't trust them. So that's going to get in you and become part of your makeup, so that when you go and get married yourself, you are going to struggle with trust. None of this is rocket science that I'm going to be talking about. You don't need a psychologist to tell you this stuff. You know this instinctively, and you know it from your own experience. Okay, so those are two possibilities. Another one is the high conflict home. I think I've talked to you all about this. That was my background, where you are kind of immune to the effects of fighting, or not the effects. You're immune to the process of fighting, and therefore more comfortable with that scenario. And maybe you're less gentle in your approach to conflict when you're married yourself because it's just normal for you. So you might not watch your words as carefully or your expressions, or, it's just a comfortable, not comfortable isn't even right, familiar. That's the word. It's just a familiar space for you. And if you're married to somebody who had a different experience, they're not coming at it from the same space. So you're going to have communication problems. So that's another one. Single parent home, alcoholic home, high conflict home. And then another one is a conflict avoidant home. There are people who they never saw it. And so they assumed that everything was fine. But silence is not better than conflict. It's actually worse, in my opinion, because you're not dealing with it. And that's going to build up over time. And then you have all these problems when you do attempt to have a conversation that's difficult, which there's no way to avoid it. So that could come out passive aggressively when you do go to address it, or you're hysterical and you're just flying off the handle and you're cursing. I mean, when you're not addressing stuff, all those emotions have to go somewhere. They don't just evaporate. They're like sitting inside of you, so that when you end up having the conversation that's hard with your spouse, which you will, it just doesn't come out right because it's been sitting there for so long. So that's the conflict avoidant home. So you just never, you just try to avoid it at all costs because you never saw it and you assume that the peace that it seems like you might have had in your upbringing with your parents was a good thing. But that is very often not the case. And then the last one is an abusive home, which is also very sadly common. And that's where you really are going to become, obviously, it's just going to be more fear-based. You're just going to become immobilized by fear, understandably so. And so any conflict might make you feel like it's going to turn into that other, bad space. And that's not necessarily what it's going to do, but the fear may keep you from being able to communicate well. So all of these things that we grew up with, pretty much you're going to have grown up in one of those homes, unless you were fortunate enough to be in the ideal scenario where parents address their issues and work them out. And you've seen that, a positive influence or what have you. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who had that, which is great. But these are more common. And you are going to bring yourself with you, obviously, when you go to have your own family. And unless you've worked all these things out, which how do you work it out? You don't work it out by yourself. You're going to work it out over the course of your marriage. There's no way to get to a place where, I'm over all that and I figured it all out all by myself and now I'm ready to get married. And then you just do everything swimmingly from that point on. It just that's not realistic. So the question then is what to do about it. And I think what to do about your, having been raised in different households when it comes to all this stuff. And I think that for many people, it ends up being a lifelong process. So to give you an example, I've been collecting responses recently from listeners, email subscribers, and even former coaching clients to a very specific question, which is, what is your biggest relationship frustration? And this has taken me a couple weeks to do. And I've ended up grouping them all by topic. So I gathered all the answers and I'm putting them under like money, sex, tech use, all these different things that people are dealing with in their marriage and relationships that are causing them the most trouble. And by far, the most responses fall under the communication umbrella. By far. If you saw my list, you'd say, wow. So I put that at the top. The second one, for the record, it has to do with roles and responsibilities. That's another big one. But the number one was communication. So I'm going to read just 3. I have a huge list. I just picked 3 I'm going to read to give you a flavor of what I see with respect to this issue. And like I said in a previous episode, I'm not using names anymore. So I'm just going to read them without any identification. My biggest relationship frustration today is communication. My message is always taken as criticism. Her message always sounds to me like criticism and complaint. Defensiveness is always present in our conversations, and the skeletons in the closet are always opened. Another one. The way conflict was resolved in my wife's family was like World War I. Last man standing wins. Whoever outlasts everyone else in the argument wins. Facts, logic, common sense have nothing to do with it. So unless something is really, really, really important, I've learned to just let it go. Third one. I struggle with having a healthy, argumentative relationship, which might sound like a funny thing to say, but I don't think she means argumentative relationship. I think she means how to argue in a healthy way. That's all. My parents never fought. A good 45 plus years of marriage, but never fought. And I am not exactly a fighter either. So that one kind of goes back to what I was saying about conflict avoidance. Now, I'm not saying her parents were. It might have just, if she said they never fought, that concerns me because I think there's a lot of things kids don't see. it would be extremely bizarre to literally never fight and have a really healthy marriage. Never fight. In fact, to some degree, you want to have that, which is why I'm going to try and talk to you about. I'm not going to try and talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about how to fight in a healthy way. If you're never fighting, you're never really getting to the kernel of what's going on in your heart and mind and soul, and marrying that with your person's heart, mind, and soul. So it's almost like you're floating around like roommates, trying to avoid things. If you're never having any kind of fight, it just doesn't feel natural, because you want somebody with whom somebody you can contend with and have some sort of friction to get to the other side. I mean, who wants somebody who's just agreeing with them all the time about everything? Which is not to say there isn't a place for silence. We're going to talk about that, and not communicating, because that's actually part of good communication, is not communicating. But okay, so those are the three examples I came up with. The idea that silence is somehow, as far as that last one goes, the idea that silence is somehow superior to fighting is just wrong. That's basically the point I'm making. It's in that communication, which can be very painful, where you're going to learn the most about the other person, that will then allow you to do better. And so you're not really growing if you're not having those difficult conversations. If you're avoiding them all the time, then you're kind of stuck in the space you're in, and there's no growth. So I'm not saying that's the case. That was the case with her parents' marriage. I don't know them, but that's what I think of when I think of somebody who says my parents never fought. I truly believe that divorce, rampant divorce, is why, or the divorce culture is why so many couples today are hesitant to get into things with their spouse that are difficult, having those difficult conversations, or fighting, if you will. I think and I could be wrong. You guys can email me and say one way or the other, especially if you're a product of divorce, that they either assume that saying nothing is better for your marriage, or they don't know how to talk in such a way that brings about the desired result, and they're afraid of the damage they think it will do. That's what I'm guessing is why people are so hesitant, and certainly what I'm experiencing with coaching, that I'm always surprised at how much people are not communicating about things that need to be communicated about, need to be addressed. I think, and this is where the commitment piece is so huge, and why I added it there, because this is something that someone who's a product of divorce isn't going to feel as viscerally as somebody whose parents did not get divorced. Because if you know the person isn't going to leave you, if you know that, it frees you up to say what you really think and feel, because you're not worried about that piece, about how they're going to receive it, and are they going to still love you, or are they going to still be with you, or are they going to I think that's what my husband's kind of taught me about that, because as you guys know, he is a product of divorce. My parents were married for 44 years, very high conflict, so not preferable, but definitely different from being a product of divorce. And so he's always tried to explain to me that's the missing piece, is that you just know that no one's going anywhere, and so that changes how you approach communication. That said, there's a way to say what you think and feel. There's a way to communicate, and there's a way not to communicate. So I'm going to talk about both of those things right now. I'm going to talk about the things you don't ever want to do, and then the things you want to make sure you do. Just sort of tips for fighting well, if you will. Okay. So here are the things you don't ever want to do, which is not to say that if you accidentally do it, you don't have a recourse, because you always do. We'll talk about that. But in general, these are things that are not helpful in any way, shape, or form. I mean, they're kind of obvious. Screaming, shouting, cursing, those types of behaviors are basically, well, not only will they hurt your relationship big time, but they're an indication that you are personally out of control and you of your emotions, and you need to walk away if you're feeling that, welling up within you. I'm trying to get myself around the head of somebody who, I've never had those feelings ever. I've never had a feeling towards someone where I want to curse at them, but I've seen it. And so I'm trying to get my head in there and say, look, you must know when it's about to erupt. And I certainly work with people who do this. It's your job to get in control of your emotions and remove yourself until you can calm yourself down and have a decent conversation with your spouse. And that might take half a day. I don't know. But the screaming and the name calling or cursing is just not, no, just bad, all around bad. So those are kind of obvious, obvious things. Another real obvious one is making threats. As a coach, I've been truly astounded to hear about the number of women in particular. I haven't seen this too much with the husbands, who threaten to divorce their husbands if, such and such doesn't happen, or whatever the reason may be. Just the whole idea of threatening divorce. I think this comes from a culture that is so lackadaisical about divorce that you would even throw it out there so willy-nilly like that, because certainly people, I do not think, did that 30, 40 years ago, when it was assumed that when you got married, you were going to stay married unless someone was hurting you. So this is one of those subtle effects of divorce that doesn't get any attention, that you are now using it as a weapon because it's technically there and people think it's, no big deal. This is hugely destructive to a marriage, to threaten divorce. No one should ever be threatening divorce. So those are the obvious ones: screaming, name calling, cursing, and making threats. Then there's the, I want to say more benign, because compared to what I just said, it is totally benign, but it's not benign. And that is things like making faces. This is something that I struggle with because I am so out there with the way I think and feel at all times. And it's been an ongoing issue in my marriage where Bill has asked me, not so much asked me, complained about the faces I make, which has caused, it's funny because that conversation looks something like this. When he got with me initially, he loved the fact, and he will tell you this, in fact, he said it for years, over and over, to anybody who was listening, that he loved the fact that you always knew where you stood with me. There were no games. I don't even know how to play games. It's just not in my thing. It's not in my, I'm not capable of it. His mother would never tell him what she really thought or felt. And so that really affected him. This goes back to the childhood messaging. For years, he wanted to know what she thought and felt about something, and she would not share it. And it affected him deeply, so that when he met somebody who was the complete opposite in that one respect, he clung to it unknowingly. I don't think that's how much you're, what you experience over and over on a daily basis gets in you, so that when you find something opposite of what you've always wanted, you go toward it. So then the running joke is sort of, well, be careful what you wish for, because that has a flip side too, right? You may love the fact that I don't play games, or you always know where you stand or what I think, but you could also not like the fact that you always know where I stand or what I think. And one of the problems with that is that it's very hard for me to hide what I think on my face. I yeah. So that's been destructive because he, if there are times when you just need to not be so affected by what someone's saying. And so whatever you automatically carry with you, it's your job to curb, fix, improve, whatever you want to say, when you are in your own marriage later, if it is negatively hurting it. And so in my particular marriage, that would be an example of something that is hopefully very benign compared to those other things, but it's still a thing. So I have to sort of develop a poker face as much as possible. And sometimes that means I put my head down because he's freer to talk when my head is down because he can't see what I think throughout what he's saying, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's an example of our communication stuff. So those are the things that to not do the ones I could think of that came to mind. I'm sure there's other ones that are a little more obvious, but those are the ones I could think of. Tips for fighting well. Tips for fighting well. I think this is going to be where it's really important, and hopefully you can use these and just start implementing them right away. Number 1, timing. It's really important to time your conversations well. In other words, you don't necessarily have the conversation that you need to have about whatever the moment you feel it. You almost need to plan for it because you want to make sure you're both going to be able to be receptive. So what are some examples of when you wouldn't be receptive? Well, if you're sleep deprived, if you haven't slept the night before, you were up all night for some reason. If there are, because you can't think straight and there's nothing constructive is going to happen if you're sleep deprived when you're having a serious conversation. When there are kids around, little ones especially, but really any kids around, you need a space for you and him or her to be dealing with what you're dealing with without any kids around. If it's, of something they shouldn't hear, which is not to say that you should never fight in front of your children. That's not what I'm saying, because I don't believe that. I think you absolutely should fight in front of your children, and show them, if you can, show them how to do it well. And which basically means coming back together at the end of the conversation so that they see you're still a team, even after you've, duked it out, so to speak. So there's a space for that. But if there are little kids around and you got to talk about something seriously, that's really not helpful because you're going to get distracted and you're not going to be able to have the conversation. So that's kind of obvious. If you're hungover, or actually not even just hungover, if there's alcohol in the picture at all, don't have the conversation. That those two things are not going to mix. How many people do you know, yourselves included, have the conflict when alcohol is present? It's obvious that that's going to happen when you've had too much, not even too much to drink. Sometimes just one drink will do it. It just doesn't mix well. I mean, you could probably count on your hands the number of conflicts or fights you have had just as a result of that. When you come home at the end of a party, for example, don't be talking then if you've tied one on. Or even if you've had one, like I said, forget tying one on. I mean, it can happen after one or two drinks. Just they don't mix. So if you know you've imbibed, then you just moratorium on any conversations. That's kind of how we do it, although we're not big drinkers in general. But if somebody's had some, then we just don't even go there. So I would highly recommend that. Let's learn the hard way. Thank you. After 25 years of marriage. So I'm passing it on now. If you're newly married, you'll save yourself a lot. So the timing is very important. You really need phones out of the way, kids out of the way, alcohol out of the way, and you need to be looking at each other and dealing with it. Number 2, choose your words carefully. be very, very careful about what you want to say. Gather your thoughts first and say what you mean rather than just say what you feel. Because, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about the high conflict home versus the single parent home or the conflict avoidant home. The person who is used to conflict, you're talking about me right now, isn't going to be as careful there because it's just second nature to just call it like it is. But you have to be aware of how the other person's receiving that, and they're not used to that. And anyway, it's just good to choose your words very carefully. You should do that. That shows that you've, you need to put time and thought into it and not just emote for emoting's sake. Number 3, talk about yourself, not about the other person or what he or she did wrong. So I don't know if I know I've talked to you guys about the Dale Carnegie book. It's like a Bible to me, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and he refers to stuff like this all the time. How people receive, I don't know, I guess the word's criticism, but if there's no way to be married and not deal with constructive criticism. You have to be able to hear that from your person. The question is, how are you going to do that? And I don't think, what I've learned the hard way is that if you focus on how you feel as a result of something rather than what the person did, that person's going to be able to hear it much more easily than if you just go on the attack. Like, you never do this, or blah, 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 blah. I feel sad. I feel alone. I feel trapped, whatever the thing is. Focus on yourself, and the person will be able to receive what you're saying much more easily than if you go on the attack. That's all I'm saying. Another one that is kind of sounds sort of too easy to be true, and I used to think it myself, but it really works. And that is to take super deep breaths during any kind of heated conversation, or even if it's not heated, just a difficult conversation. Let's just call these things difficult conversations, hard conversations that there are strong feelings on both sides. Deep breaths are huge. I mean, it forces your brain to sort of slow down, and it's like you taking control of your brain. So you like breathe in through your nose and then out really slowly through your mouth. And you do that a couple times. Going back to what I said earlier about putting your head down, that's another one. Put your head down and do it. It's really, really helpful. It's just sort of I love yoga. And I'm a big stretcher. And so I'm not really, I don't know what that word is for people who love that sort of thing, but that's not how I would describe myself in general. But when it comes to this, I'm a big believer in stretching and deep breathing and all of that. It's super helpful. And then the last one, which I think we all struggle with, I know my husband and I both do, but I think it's really common, and that is to listen. If you want to fight well, you need to learn how to listen. And there's a lot of, in fact, there's a book. Shoot. Oh yeah. I just listened to a whole podcast on this from the Art of Manliness. I don't know if any of you know that podcast, but he just had someone on this week called, the book is called, it's, the title is actually Shut the Fuck Up, but it's STFU because, you don't want to put that on the book cover. So that's actually the title. And then there's a huge subtitle, like the power of silence and what that can do for you in your life. It was awesome. That's kind of similar to the ability to listen. There is an enormous power in silence, and the ability to hold back and allow silence to do its thing is just massive. And that's kind of what listening is. When you just literally don't talk or interrupt, I mean, it's magical and it's immediate, by the way. I mean, you can try this hands down right now, tonight, the next time you're going to have a conversation with your spouse, male or female. This isn't a gender thing, male or female. Just be quiet. Just be quiet. You can't believe how much positive energy will come out of that. It's kind of huge. So this is something I feel really strongly about because Bill and I both struggle with interrupting each other, and it's not meant to be rude. It's just not. It has to do with, well, there's a lot of things it has to do with. That's why this goes back to the childhood thing. We're both the youngest, always wanting to be heard, having a lot to say, feeling very passionate about something. And so it kind of comes out before we can stop it. And that's what I mean about this communication thing is it's almost like your body's doing something before you can help it. So you have to train your brain to overrule your body's natural responses to fighting or / communication, whatever you want to call it. Like I just spoke with a coaching client the other day who said, they don't fight. Everything goes fine for a few months. And then when they do have it, it's like all out war, screaming, name calling, all of it, all the stuff I said is no. That's because there's not enough being dealt with on a regular basis. And so it wells up in you. So listening is just something that allows the other person to feel heard. And all it requires of you is to just be quiet. And it may feel like you're not doing anything, especially when you have something where you really want to say, but you're doing more than you could ever do when you're talking. So the irony of this communication thing is that there is actually a space for not communicating, although I wouldn't use the word communicating because I think being quiet and listening is communicating. So you have to, again, choose your words carefully here about what I mean. But yeah, so to go back over those, timing, choosing your words carefully, talking about yourself and not the other person, how you feel, not what they did. Deep breathing when necessary, and listening. Now, those things, they kind of seem obvious not obvious. They seem easy to understand, but that doesn't make them easy to do. I mean, again, going back to whatever we saw growing up, we might have to be completely rerouting the way we do this thing. And that could take a very, very long time. I mean, that's why, again, going back to the commitment piece, if you're in it and you each understand where the other person's coming from, then you can have a little more grace there and just keep trying the next day to do it better. That's really all any of us can do. And just to close out, you might have heard of the Gottman Institute. Some of you, John Gottman and his wife, they've been doing this for decades. And one of the things he talks about that I really like is to think of your marriage as a bank account and how many positive to negative interactions you put in on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. If there are, I forget the exact number, but a lot more positive interactions to the negative ones on a regular basis, then when it comes time to deal with the hard conversation, they're much easier to swallow because you've been fortified with all this good stuff. That's kind of the idea behind it. Yeah. So I really like that, thinking of your marriage as a bank account. Okay, so that's it, guys. I hope that all that has been helpful. Again, as always, would love to hear from you. And yeah, that's it. Until next time, have a good week. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and to leave us a review, as well as share this episode with a friend. As always, you may reach me with any questions or comments at Suzanne@thesuzannevenkershow.com. And if you would like to support this podcast, which would be very much appreciated, you can do so at patreon.com/The Suzanne Venker Show. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.